Released 2 years prior to Castlevania 64, Symphony of the Night was one of the few major releases of its generation to opt out of the 3D craze in favor of traditional 2D pixel art. Pushed forward by soon-to-be series producer Koji Igarashi, Symphony reinvented the series formula with fast-paced combat and explorative non-linear level design, further establishing what is known as the Metroidvania genre. And this truly might be the series' single best-looking game. Symphony not only completely restructured the gameplay format of the franchise, but it also forever recontextualized the series' aesthetic and image, building off of the foundation that Rondo of Blood had created. Like Rondo, Symphony further refined the series' pixel art, but to a much greater effect this time around. You really can't understate just how gracefully smooth some of these animations are. I mean, look at the main character Alucard. Unlike vampire hunters from the previous games who stomped forward with stiff, heavy strides, Alucard is swift, weightless, and graceful. The dude's got frames for days, gliding across the floor with the exaggerated swagger of a black-caped Dampier. While Rondo took strides in better emphasizing the movement, Symphony actually fleshed it out by boosting frame counts tremendously, evident in the brilliantly fluid enemies. And you can tell that they were starting to get real creative with their designs as well, two of my favorite being the Valhalla Knight and the Hunting Girl. Speaking of enemies, while previous games featured blood, Symphony was the series' first foray into true body horror, with a handful of genuinely disgusting enemies and bosses, the two best being the Legion and the Beelzebub, with huge, awe-inspiring sprites. It's honestly surprising that this game only got a teen rating. While the older games mostly utilized classic movie monsters, the team was beginning to experiment with creations of their own. Pixel art was nothing new for the series, yet no game has ever quite matched Symphony. There are just so many enemies and tiny details all throughout the game, and there's just so much flash and flare to the combat compared to previous entries. It truly is a mecca of high-fidelity pixel art, and it proved that sprite work still had a bright future, even as 3D became the dominant format. But it's not just relying on the sole quality of its character animation. The added technical benefits of the PS1 were not put to waste. For example, there's some really dynamic sprite scaling, it added this wicked transparent trailing effect to Alucard's movements, plus the PS1 allowed for dozens of extra scrollable sprite layers, as well as 3D objects in the background and foreground, both of which really add an extra layer of depth and dimension to the environments. This is also the point where the Castlevania world really developed its visual identity. Whereas games like Castlevania 3 and 4 presented Dracula's castle as a far more decrepit, derelict set of ruins, Symphony presents a more refined and decadent vision. When I think of Dracula's castle in Symphony, I think of beautiful marble tile work, grand columns, rich drapery, and priceless works of art. A world of commanding Gothic architecture. And this would be the look moving forward. In terms of color, it's a bit darker and more broad than previous entries, but as with Castlevania 4, I think it suits the more atmospheric tone, in particular in the more ambient lower depths of the castle. All in all, the craftsmanship and artwork of Symphony of the Night is just exquisitely refined and tasteful. Like a glass of fine, aged wine, Symphony continues to look great even as decades pass, while most of its 3D contemporaries continue to look more and more like ass with each passing year. However, there is one very crucial element of this success story I've yet to praise: the beautiful work of Ayami Kojima. A self-taught artist and character designer, not too much is known about Ayami Kojima, other than she was a member of the Castlevania team who would continue to work on the series for almost a decade. In many ways, Kojima is to Castlevania what Yoshitaka Amano is to Final Fantasy. More than any other member of the Castlevania team, Kojima can be credited with establishing the series' new aesthetic, Fun and spooky as the previous games were, Ayami's work brought a level of delicate beauty and artfulness to the series. While maybe a bit too ornamental for some, to me, her work has a painterly quality that harmonized beautifully with the more graceful, elegant style of Symphony. More than anything, Kojima firmly and definitively pushed the series away from its Western-focused, anglicized roots, and fully into the realm of Japanese aestheticism. In contrast to the broad, heavy-set males of earlier entries, the men and women in her art have a very soft, youthful, and effeminate quality. But outside of these paintings, she's also a skilled character designer, responsible for creating many of the series' most iconic, including Symphony of the Night's rendition of Maria Rennert, which is one of my favorite character designs of all time. And if I had to pick a favorite piece of hers, I'd have to pick this one from Castlevania Chronicles, specifically because of how it merges her softer, more painterly style with the darker, more contrasty look of the classic games. But then you have the obverse of that in Lament of Innocence, with Leon Belmont basking in an array of holy energy, showing off her more subtle understanding of light and color. It also showcases the textural quality of her paintings, with their thick, visible strokes of acrylic, giving them a real physical quality you couldn't find in the more common digitized covers of the day. However, if I did have one criticism of her work, it would be that they lack the energy and momentum of the older box art, all of them being very portrait-like with little implied action or movement. But I think they added far more than they subtracted. They're really magnificent paintings. Pieces worthy of being framed within the Count's own personal collection. So yeah, there is a lot to be said about what Symphony of the Night brought to the series. And the reason I focus on it so heavily is because, for the next 10 or so years, this essentially became the default Castlevania style. While the earlier games had experimented a lot in their art direction, jumping off the critical and commercial success here, the series had clearly found its identity. And what resulted were 6 spiritual successors on the GBA and DS, which not only continued the gameplay formula of Symphony, but also maintained the same flashy pixel art and ostentatious visual design. And while most of these games are beautiful, from this point on the range of technical and stylistic variants between the titles began to narrow heavily. And while they did try new things within this framework, none of them attempted to reinvent the wheel like Symphony or 64 did. So, talking about them, you'll have to excuse me if I rifle through them a bit quicker than usual. But with that said, let's see what each new game brought to the table. Circle of the Moon was the first of these spiritual successors, and was released as the launch title for the Game Boy Advance. And while it was surely an impressive game at launch, in comparison to Symphony and of things to come, it's pretty drab. The animation is very stiff. The hero Nathan Graves' run animation is only like 3 frames long. The areas lack a sense of depth, and few of the bosses or enemies stand out. It also didn't feature any Kojima art, though the box art is still reasonably appealing in its own right. When you get down to it, Circle of the Moon was a dolled up Game Boy Color game. A nice first try for the handheld, but a clear step down nonetheless. And I think the developers realized this as Harmony of Dissonance picked up on the slack big time, making massive strides towards getting the visuals back up to par. So much so that the game notoriously skimped out on the music so as to not have it competing with the visuals on the CPU, leading to one of the series' only mediocre soundtracks. But yeah, you can immediately see this looks much better, and they even got Ayami back for the cover. But the problem is, I would actually say that they overcompensated on the visuals. Certain areas feel needlessly cartoonish and over the top. You have a lot of random rooms like this that are just flashy for the sole purpose of being flashy. There's no spatial consistency to the world either. Like, at one point you're in a villa next to an active volcano, then you go through a room, and then you're suddenly in a subterranean cave full of crystals. It makes zero sense and the whole thing just feels very sloppy. Like with how they brought back the trailing effect for the hero Juiced. Except now it's hypersensitive, and there's barely any transparency to it either, making it a bit of an eyesore. Though I do appreciate the effort, the final result of Harmony was excessive and unrefined. Moving forward, Igarashi and team would need to dial it back. And for the third and final GBA entry in the series, Aria of Sorrow, that's exactly what they did. Full stop, Aria of Sorrow is honestly probably the most unique and defined out of all of the Metroidvanias. As a pretty radical move, Aria is actually set in the future 21st century, and takes place in Japan as opposed to Europe, no less. For a gothic fantasy series, this sounds ridiculous on paper, but as we can see, it strangely really works. This is because, for the most part, it still adheres to the series' signature gothic style, as it has few explicit sci-fi elements. Yet the futuristic setting is still present. It's just more so implied and suggested through the game's art direction. You'll notice that the characters' costumes still maintain the very dressy, decadent look of games past, yet they've been recontextualized to make sense within a modern context. They have long, flowing trench coats and sleek, debonair suits, yet there are also modern touches visible. Like the protagonist Soma is wearing jeans, Hammer has a military top, and Graham Jones looks like a televangelist. The designs maintain the series' traditional look, while also creating their own unique identity within that tradition. In contrast to the very over-the-top visual style of Harmony, Aria opts for a refreshingly minimal color palette. When I think of this game, I think of a lot of cool, desaturated colors. Lots of grays, whites, cool blues, and soft purples, among others. It's sleek, and evokes a sort of futuristic minimalism. It's simple, clean, and doesn't try to do more than it needs to. This is also the point in which they really started to up their game in terms of boss designs, introducing some abstract and psychedelic monsters. Graham's transformation is equal parts beautiful as it is alien. And the otherworldly final boss against Chaos is just crazy. Almost H.R. Giger-like with its cold, psychedelic backdrop. Aria of Sorrow not only optimized its visuals for its hardware, but it was also genuinely innovative in what it was trying to do. You can tell that, despite the development team being 4 Metroidvanias in, they were still finding lots of inspiration moving forward. And Dawn of Sorrow, the direct sequel to Aria of Sorrow and the first game for the DS, was both a step forward and a step back for the series. As you'll probably notice right away, the DS allowed for huge technical improvement. The environments are wonderfully detailed, the sprites are bigger, and there's a level of fluidity to the animation that is getting close to rivaling Symphony of the Night. The game doesn't quite commit as hard to that cool, sleek look that Aria had, but it makes up for it through its sheer technical power. Power that's gone towards making the bosses more grotesque than ever. The Puppet Master, Menace, and Gurgoth might be 3 of the coolest bosses in the series' history. My favorite among them being Gurgoth, a giant dinosaur corpse with stubby limbs capable of rolling back its rotting skin at will. It's incredibly grotesque and I love it. In terms of boss design, Dawn was a peak moment for the series. However, take one look at the box art and you'll see where the misstep lies. In an attempt to appeal to younger audiences, the game ditched Kojima's masterful artwork in favor of a much more generic anime look. And not even a very good anime look. Like Circle of the Moon was clearly manga oriented, but it still had the series flair to it. This, on the other hand, just looks like very stock mid-2000s shonen. And I mean, hey, it only really affects the box art and the in-game character portraits, but it was a natural symptom of the series beginning to slog commercially. Things were getting a bit stagnant, and longtime fans were getting a bit bored of the formula. People were getting tired of seeing the same sprites used again and again and again, and just in general, things were in need of change. And while the follow-up looked just as good, Portrait of Ruin ultimately failed to instigate that change. While it did mix things up a bit by adding several distinctly non-Gothic areas to the game outside of Dracula's castle, it kept Dawn's crappy shonen art and ultimately failed to innovate artistically. New blood was still desperately needed. Enter Order of Ecclesia, where that's exactly what we got. You know how I said earlier that Symphony was the best looking Metroidvania? Well, I lied. Order of Ecclesia is the true king of 2D Castlevania art. Ecclesia goes back to the series' distinctly dark, brooding roots. Ominous black environments, refined, detailed character art, and for the most part no more goofball enemies. It's exactly what the series needed artistically. But Order is also a technical achievement. If you look at it, you'll notice that it looks better than its predecessors, but it's not immediately clear why. But I think I can pinpoint the reason. Ecclesia is incredibly textural. Textural in a way that none of the other games here are. There's a minute attention to detail in all of the game's surfaces and sprites that just wasn't present in the previous games. Despite just being jumbles of pixels, it's a world that looks like you could reach in and touch it. Just look at the precise detailing in the clouds, or the intricate foliage at twilight. Surfaces like this wall made of skeletons, or this mound of books, are so densely packed with physical detail that the whole world just has such a tangible quality to it. Hell, look at Shinoa, the heroine of this game. Look at how her hair flows as she moves. There's such a gracefulness there, and an exaggerated level of detail to it. You can tell some animator just spent days working on it alone. The brand new character art was also a huge improvement. Gone is the stock shonen crap. With these new designs, there's still a hint of anime thrown in, but in general the facial proportions are much more grounded, and the shading is less stylized and more true to life. While Dawn and Portrait were sort of cartoony and had a very generic, broad palette, here they re-emphasize the darkness, using some really deep and intense colors. It evokes something closer to Bloodlines and Rondo of Blood, which I really love, utilizing lots of deep purples, rich blues, and bloody reds. And the way that the colors are blended together is just dazzling. Somnus Reef is a melody of cold, aquatic colors, while Oblivion Ridge shows the beautiful harmony of tones in the sky of the setting sun. And God, look at this cover by Masaki Haruka. It's so good. More than anything, it reminds me a lot of Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Gloomy and moody, but also bold and colorful at the same time, precisely in line with my tastes. It serves as a great contrast piece to the light and minimal Aria of Sorrow. I like to think of the two as sort of a white album, black album kind of deal. On a technical level, Order of Ecclesia isn't leagues above its predecessors the same way, say, Symphony was over Rondo. However, they added that extra level of detail and really got the series back to its shadowy roots, and in doing so I think they achieved something truly special. This was, in my opinion, the definitive peak of Castlevania art. And I could cap the video here, however, it was not the end of the story. You see, this entire time the Metroidvania series was chugging along, different things were brewing on home consoles, as Konami was still trying to find a foothold for Castlevania in the AAA gaming scene, after 64 and Legacy of Darkness had turned out to be disappointments. What resulted from this were two PS2 games, Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness. these are two games that have a very similar set of pros and cons, and I think when you look at them in isolation, they're both great looking games. Each one captures Kojima's art style perfectly in 3D. They're dark and decadent and instantly recognizable as Castlevania. Clearly opting for a much more mature AAA audience, Lament and Curse both skew away from the cartoony antics of the 2D Metroidvania games. For the most part, that is. And while I like the more serious tone, I find that the enemy designs in both of these lack the playfulness and inventiveness that those games had in spade. The vast majority being either standard beasts or standard humanoids, the type of enemies you would expect from a dark fantasy game. Your Cyclops, your Wolf, your Demon Knight, etc. They're all very clean-cut, well-proportioned, and a bit predictable. Contrast this to the 2D games where you're fighting shadows, robots, furniture, and Cthulhu. And this is kind of the general vibe I get from both of these games. They look good, but lack a distinct personality. And despite their bigger production value, in some ways I actually feel like they did less than the handheld titles. Detailed 3D modeling is expensive, and it can be hard to create a visually rich, believable world on a mid-sized budget. This is why most pixel art today comes from the indie scene, because it's cheap but still offers the potential of a lot of visual richness. Meanwhile, the cheaper 3D games that do succeed visually usually tend to go for something more minimal or impressionistic. But the strength of Kojima's art was always in its extravagant, fleshed-out detail. And so while they captured that here, it did come with a very heavy production cost. Lament and Curse tend to reuse a lot of environments. While Lament has some fantastic-looking battle arenas, that's really all it has. You often get the feeling that you're just moving from battle arena to battle arena to battle arena. When I picture these games in my head, I just imagine Hector or Leon running down an endless series of stock hallways. And when it comes to animation, these two characters are also noticeably a bit stiff. While presentable, Leon and Hector seem very wooden and robotic. However, if I'll sing the praise of anything in these games, it's the excellent texture work on the enemies. I love the deep-set bones on the skeletons, the bulbous veiny skin on the ogres, or the faded stained robes on the wizards. Despite being a bit cliche, the enemies do look great. But still, being mid-budget 3D models, they didn't have the same ability to twist, morph, and deform the same way that the 2D sprites could. Detailed, grotesque enemies that looked great in Symphony just kinda looked cheap in Curse of Darkness. It's not bad, it's just underwhelming, which is kind of how I describe these games in general. Lament and Curse were both successful mid-tier 3D games. However, Symphony, Aria, and Ecclesia were top of their class. And while these games do have their fair share of fans, I never got the sense that the enthusiasm was really there for them. And while gameplay was definitely the core reason for this, I do think the style and marketing for these games contributed. It can be easy to forget, but remember that Castlevania once had its roots in a very campy Western style. And I've always gotten the impression that most of the old school fans were never that jazzed about this era of Castlevania. I can see why this very flashy anime aesthetic didn't appeal to Western gamers, which is clearly where the money is. While anime did get big here in the 2000s, you have to remember that traditional Western fantasy was also booming at the time. And that's a genre that's traditionally very rough and grounded in style. So it's not hard to see why Castlevania, with its confusing mix of Eastern and Western influences, would strike gamers at the time as kind of off-brand. And yet, it was this weebish style that the series would take to its grave. In fact, it would intensify, with the traditional Vania series ending on the retroactively hilarious Castlevania Judgement. Just as bewildering today as it was in 2008, Judgement was essentially the Smash Bros of Castlevania, bringing together all of the characters, locations, and music from the series past and putting them into a single fighting game. And with that in mind, the game's aesthetic couldn't feel any more out of place. To do the character designs, Judgement brought in famous manga artist Takeshi Obata, the illustrator behind Death Note. And his work in this game is... yeah, it's completely out of sync with the rest of the series. While some of the designs are really cool when looked at in a vacuum, they don't vibe at all with the westernized original characters, nor with the subdued and tasteful Kojima designs. Instead, we got something so aggressively weebish that it'll make your eyes bleed. Yet, it somehow made the stylistic progression from west to east feel complete. It's really sort of incredible when you consider the evolution that brought the series here. Simon Belmont went from this wide-set, rugged vampire hunter, only to gradually evolve into a slender emo twink dressed in skimpy leather gear. It's nothing if not hilarious. Clearly this wasn't working out, and the series continued to dwindle financially, with Judgement sadly being one of the final games set in the original Castlevania universe, leading to the franchise's rockiest decade since its creation.
Remember your place, boy. You will never surmount me.
You see, some series evolve very liberally, with games hopping from random aesthetic to random aesthetic on a whim. Other series are incredibly conservative, where you barely even notice the art style's slow, gradual evolution until you put the original artwork side by side with the new stuff. Castlevania, however, is a much more common breed. It flows wherever it thinks the money is. And evidently, these games weren't making money. Thus spawned the series' final, short-lived reinvention with the Lords of Shadow games, created by Spanish developer Mercury Steam, with the series never seeing full development from Konami or any Japanese developer ever again. And I'm gonna level with you guys. I don't see much point in talking about these games. And it's not because I don't think these games look good. On the contrary, I really like and respect the art behind them. However, these aren't Castlevania games. One of the things I love about the Castlevania series is its extremely strong sense of tradition, with countless enemies, characters, and songs appearing again and again and again over the series' history. And yet here, the vast majority of those traditions were severed. The Lords of Shadow games rebooted the lore, created a brand new sound, crafted an entirely new line of enemies, revamped the gameplay, and were just overall very creatively detached from the minds that had created the originals. Lords of Shadows made a very determined effort to appeal to a large Western audience, drawing most of their inspiration from other big Western releases like God of War. And again, I respect these games for what they are, and I think they were backed by some incredible artists, as evidenced by their great art books. But it's clear that they just hail from an entirely different artistic tradition. They probably have more in common aesthetically with The Witcher than they do with the Konami games. These games deserve to be judged by their own merits. But whether we analyze them or not, we would still come to the same conclusion, as after a respectable 3-game effort, the Lords of Shadow series ultimately died off itself. And now, as of 2021, the Castlevania series remains dormant. And much like with the Count himself, we may have to wait another 100 years before it's resurrected. But don't get too discouraged. Because while the canon games themselves may have ceased production and may never be released from Konami's cold inner dungeons, their artistic legacy lives on through numerous avenues. First of all, in the most direct connection, you have the beloved animated Netflix show, a series which not only pays homage to the classic games and nails that quintessential Castlevania aesthetic, but also flawlessly blends the series' Eastern and Western influences. It combines Western writing and popular fantasy tropes like you'd see on Game of Thrones, and mixes them with flashy, over-the-top anime action. The character designs strongly evoke anime, but still maintain more heavy-set, masculine characters, with simpler, less decadent costumes. It utilizes the series' dark aesthetic and contrasty, rich color palette. Overall, it just fuses together its influences exceptionally well. When I first saw the Season 1 trailer, I was able to recognize it as American, but I've also met people who were under the impression that it was straight Japanese anime. So it's really no surprise that this show has been equally successful in Japan as it has been in North America and Europe. But the inspiration is also there in less obvious places. One place where I think it's very evident is Dark Souls. A series that, while it has no direct linkage to Castlevania, to me still carries on the series' spirit, showcasing dark fantasy with flashy, grotesque monsters, beautiful gothic architecture, and immersive, moody environments. I know it's not quite the same thing, but to me they're like the amazing 3D Metroidvanias that we never got. But if that's still not enough, look no further than the spiritual successor franchise Bloodstained, created by series producer Koji Igarashi, which carries on the tradition of both the Classicvania and Metroidvania subseries. With Curse of the Moon, you'll get the colorful, comic book-like look of the originals, and with Ritual of the Night, you'll get the flashy, detailed, and experimental look and feel of the Metroidvanias. Hell, he even got Tom Dubois and Ayami Kojima in for one last bout, each representing their respective era. These are great games that manage to both remain faithful to their mother series, while still maintaining their own unique flair. And unlike with Lords of Shadow, I have no issue accepting these games as a legitimate successor to the classic series. So while the main Castlevania series may be on ice, I'm honestly content with what we've gotten over the past few years. Obviously, we're all unhappy about Konami's current situation, but honestly, I'm optimistic about the future. Much like with Silent Hill and Metal Gear Solid, the passion for Castlevania and its influence is so strong that I can't help but believe that it'll outlive its publisher. Maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I honestly think that one day these IPs will land in the hands of developers who will do them justice and continue their tradition. But until then, its legacy will continue to be preserved. The Castlevania franchise created a prestigious history for itself, one that I'm confident will stand the test of time. Whether it be a game from 1989 or 2009, I truly believe that these games will always look great, and will continue to inspire.